Hello, 2T4s. We are the Frosh Week Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion SubComm, and we're going to present to you a quick overview of a concept we consider to be extremely important at school: anti-racism and cultural sensitivity. This is one of 3 videos we've created to explore important equity-related topics at school. The other 2 can be found on our YouTube page. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge our privileges as settlers on this land. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. While we may not currently be present on the U of T campus, we continue to benefit from the institutions on the land that it occupies.
Now, before we dive into our discussion on anti-racism, it's important that we first discuss the concepts of discrimination and oppression. Discrimination is what happens when a prejudice, a biased belief inherited from stereotypes, is acted upon. That is, when an individual treats someone else differently on the basis of their belonging to a certain group. In this sense, discrimination can happen to anyone, and any aspect of one's identity can be targeted in an act of discrimination. No matter who you are or what aspect of your identity is being targeted, this can always be incredibly harmful and hurtful.
However, we must recognize that there are some communities that have had to face such discrimination as a result of their collective identity consistently and systematically over generations. Often, the discrimination that these communities have faced have resulted in violent mistreatment and have marginalized these communities culturally and economically. Over the course of history, the stereotypes and prejudices behind this treatment have built discrimination into many of the power structures that govern how we live, into law and policy, the criminal justice system, the education system, the media, and many more. As a result, every single person who lives under these systems, so basically everyone, takes in messages that reinforce these stereotypes and prejudices in the way that we think about and interact with members of these communities. When individuals that belong to these communities face discrimination on an interpersonal level, it doesn't just impact the individual. It reinforces the much larger systems of injustice that their community has faced over centuries. Because of this, we need a different word for discrimination that occurs towards people belonging to traditionally marginalized communities. So we use the word oppression. Every act of oppression feeds into the much larger systems of oppression that are built into our society, whether that's an individual belief, a discriminatory interaction, or decisions made by those in positions of power. As such, we need to be aware of how our individual actions might reinforce these systems. Oppression can happen according to many different dimensions of identity. However, in our discussion about anti-racism and cultural sensitivity, we're going to focus on 3 of these dimensions: race, ethnicity, and national origin. Race is a social or political construct used to confer advantage and disadvantage, typically based on physical characteristics, although without biological justification. Ethnicity is a population group whose members identify with each other on the basis of common nationality, language, or shared cultural traditions. National origin refers to the country a person was born in and can also refer to where their ancestors lived.
Racism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia are the systems of oppression linked to these aspects of identity. Racism is the system of oppression targeting Black, Indigenous, Asian, and other non-white individuals. Ethnocentrism is the system of oppression targeting individuals who identify with non-dominant cultures. And xenophobia is the system of oppression targeting individuals whose national origin is not their current location.
So what do racism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia look like? There are 2 ways that individuals can perpetuate these systems of oppression: through macroaggressions and through microaggressions. Macroaggressions are large-scale, overt behaviors that target a whole community. Making a discriminatory comment that targets an entire race, ethnicity, or religion can be classified as a macroaggression. However, most of the time, the ways we perpetuate oppression are a lot more subtle, so much so that we don't even notice when we're doing them. Microaggressions are defined as subtle, indirect comments towards an individual of a certain group that communicates negative stereotypes about that group. This often occurs as a result of the unconscious biases we hold towards these communities. As a result of the stereotypes and prejudices we've developed over the course of our lives, due to the discriminatory society we exist within. Often, we are not aware of how harmful these sorts of comments are when we make them, and how they can impact those who receive them. Here's a YouTube video that goes over how microaggressions can impact those who face them.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. He's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up
Do you
everywhere.
know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a
So
day,
pretty.
Can I touch it, please?
Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
So what do racist microaggressions actually look like? Here are a few examples. A micro-insult is characterized by communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Micro-invalidations are characterized by communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. A micro-assault is an explicit racial derogation characterized primarily by a verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt the intended victim through name-calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory actions. So what should we do when we see or hear someone behaving in a racist or culturally insensitive way? The most important thing is to speak up. It is really important that as a community, we collectively agree that these kinds of behaviors are not acceptable in our school and act accordingly. Make sure to confront what was said directly. Consider saying something like, "Hey, I know you might have meant that as a joke, but that comment was racist and it made people uncomfortable." It's also important that you do your own research to learn more about racism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia so that you can avoid behaviors that perpetrate these systems of oppression. It is not the job of individuals who experience oppression to educate you on these topics. It's important that you do the work to seek out knowledge on your own. Finally, if an individual does choose to share their experiences with racial and cultural oppression with you, it's important that you listen to them, believe them, and validate any pain they are feeling.
So how can we avoid microaggressions? The first way is to be conscious about how people self-identify. Social identity is the term given to the parts of our identity that are assigned to us by others, whereas self-identity is a term given to the parts of our identity we assign to ourselves. It is important to respect how people self-identify if you are trying to refer to their race, ethnicity, or national origin. Every individual will have different preferences for the language they associate with. It is important to listen to what people call themselves before addressing them with a racial or ethnic category. Second, it is important that we only use racial or cultural qualifiers when necessary. For example, when describing a group of people, it is not necessary to mention their race unless it is directly relevant to the conversation. If race or culture is relevant to the conversation, it is important to be specific with language. Be mindful of using race, ethnicity, or national origin appropriately depending on context, and be specific when you use the language. For example, instead of referring to an individual as African, classify them as Nigerian, Ghanaian, Kenyan, etc. Finally, remember that all stereotypes are bad stereotypes. Even if they assign favorable qualities to someone, stereotypes generally erase individuality and don't give individuals an opportunity to define themselves outside of their racial, ethnic, or cultural identity.
One concept that is important to understand in the context of anti-racism is privilege. This word has a really bad rep. A lot of the time, people feel that being told they have privilege means that their own struggles and hardships are being invalidated as a result of their identity. However, privilege does not mean that you have had an easy life or that your struggles aren't being recognized. All privilege means is that for a certain aspect of your identity, you haven't had to face the same issues as those who have had to face a systemic oppression for the same aspect of their identity. In the case of racism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia, privilege means that you haven't experienced systemic or institutional discrimination on the basis of your race, ethnicity, or national origin. It's important that we reflect on our privileges so we can be more conscious of the ways that these systems of oppression impact those who are targeted by them. One other type of microaggression that is important to be aware of in the context of cultural sensitivity is cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is defined as taking intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. This can include unauthorized use of another culture's dance, dress, music, language, folklore, cuisine, traditional medicine, religious symbols, etc. It's most likely to be harmful when the source community is a minority group that has been oppressed or exploited in other ways, or when the object of appropriation is particularly sensitive, such as sacred objects. When considering taking part in a tradition or activity that belongs to a culture outside of your own, consider asking yourself the following questions. To what ethnic, racial, or cultural group does this practice belong? Is this group traditionally oppressed? Has this group historically faced punishment, violence, or other oppression as a result of engaging in this practice? How do you benefit from this practice? What privileges make it possible for you to benefit from this practice without scrutiny? And finally, would a person from this group be uncomfortable with you engaging in this practice?
Being aware of privileges and calling out racism when you see it is part of practicing allyship to those who are targeted by racist, ethnocentric, and xenophobic systems of oppression. Allyship is the act of using your own privileges in an oppressive system to support others who do not share the same privileges. Note that we use practice allyship as a verb instead of being an ally as a noun. Being an ally is not something you can claim yourself. The only people who can decide if you are or aren't an ally are the communities of people you are trying to support.
In a system of racial oppression, it is not enough to simply be not racist. Practicing allyship to communities of color means being actively anti-racist. Anti-racism acknowledges that we all have racist thoughts, beliefs, and motivations as a result of the systemic racial oppression we have lived in our entire lives. Practicing anti-racism means remaining conscious of this, as well as constantly educating and reflecting to understand how we can dismantle the prejudices and biases within ourselves and our communities. Here are some important resources for learning more about anti-racism and cultural sensitivity on campus. The Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, the Indigenous Student Services and First Nations House, the Center for Indigenous Studies, and the Multi-Faith Center.
All right, everyone, thank you for watching. Remember that we have 2 more videos available to watch on our YouTube account, one on sexual and gender diversity, and one on building a culture of consent. Make sure to check them out. Have a great Frosh week.